my man, KJ. No, KJ, how you doing, man? I'm sorry for the delay. I
Not a
that is
problem.
that is a difficult place to switch off. Like it's kind of like somebody's saying something very deep. Like they've been killing us. They bombed my kids. They had people in bags, and then you turn around and say, "Okay, I need to close out." That is a
Yeah.
hell of a transition.
No,
So
no,
yes,
that's a hell of a transition, and I just want to add something to that.
please.
I mean, she
And by the
spoke
way, she's right. Just before she is talking as a human being, and I didn't want to interrupt her for it. But please,
absolutely, and she spoke about being a direct eyewitness to the Lebanon pager attacks, right?
yes.
Now, this is what's going on in warfare. There's something called the third offset. It's essentially distribution, dispersion, diffusion, diffused attacks. But we're also seeing disguise and deceit, and so that is a very, very kind of uh, you know concrete part of war. And we saw it in against Russia. We saw it
Hmm.
in Lebanon, and it signals
Wow.
that the war is continually escalating across the planet. But inside this, we also have to note that, and I've said this before, it was a Taiwanese pager company that subcontracted with,
Yes.
that gave its brand in order to create the shell company in order to enable these pager attacks. And I've said this many times before, but Taiwan Island has a long history with allying with pariah states such as South Africa and Israel, and subcontracting and doing the dirty operations for the United States. So,
Mhm.
probably the example that people have the closest sense of what happened is from the 1950s to the 1970s. The Taiwan regime, they maintained and they ran the drug running airline Air America for the CIA. It was actually called Civil Air Transport, CAT, but in U.S. popular parlance, it's called Air America. And this was the drug running airline that the CIA used. It was also used for all kinds of dirty under the books operations, including the final helicopter that took off from Saigon when Vietnam fell. That was actually
Really?
Yes, that helicopter was Air America's helicopter. And they were also, doing all the kind of logistical work for supplying the Hmong and the other insurgents that the US was trying to use as counterinsurgency. So Taiwan has a long and ugly history of aligning and being this kind of subcontractor for US dirty tricks. And of course, once again, here's the alliance. It was Israel, South Africa, and Taiwan. One example: South Africa was building a nuclear bomb,
Right.
right? Where were they getting the technology from? Who was helping them?
Israel, I suppose.
Yes, Israel. It was Israel that was helping them build the atomic bomb. And then Taiwan was financing it. And so, for example, they drew up a contract to buy 2,000 tons of uranium from South Africa. So, this is the kind of infernal triangle. And of course, South Africa doesn't exist anymore. But we see these kind of rat lines and fascist alliances being set back up again. For example, very recently, just before the South Korean president Yoon Suk-yeol declared martial law, his top intelligence chief went to Taiwan Island and asked for their support. And the moment Yoon Suk-yeol declared martial law, the Taiwanese DPP, put out, a tweet supporting it and saying, this is the right thing. We want to do the same thing. We have the same problem. We're facing the same situation. And so we can see that, we have to understand this struggle as a global struggle. It's not simply about, a localized issue with a localized rogue state. You have to understand that these are rogue states that are subcontractors to the, to the empire. And in the case of Gold Apollo, we know that it was primarily a contractor for Western intelligence agencies. So they customized walkie-talkies and pagers for Western intelligence agencies. And then they would do soup to nuts everything, but apparently they simply had licensed the brand to a Hungarian company, and that they had no involvement in it whatsoever. And then the Hungarian company says that they're just a consulting firm. So there, the trail ends. But what is not acceptable, what is not credible, is that like a pager is not something simple. It's not. It is a complex piece of electronics. Not that complex, but
Yeah.
it can be. And certainly, the digital circuits, etc. All of this is not easy to make. And for a company that has spent, decades building out its product and its brand, to say that it's simply licensed a brand to another company without doing any due diligence, without doing any quality control, without doing any inspection, without having a contract which holds them to any standards, is simply not credible. It is
Yeah.
simply not credible. Let me give you another example. Jamal, can you make a hamburger?
Yes. I'm not great at it, but yes.
Okay. I mean, pretty much anybody can make a hamburger, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, even so, even though anybody can make a hamburger, if you want to franchise, which is another way of saying license, the McDonald's brand, they have all kinds of quality control. And you
Right.
actually have to train. And, there's a McDonald's university that, they send their managers to in order to understand the McDonald's, product. So something that everybody can make is held to the most stringent quality control standards because, the company wants to preserve their brand. So how is it conceivable that Gold Apollo was not holding its licensee to any standards, to any control? That's not possible. It's a different type. You see, branding can be something very simple, like you just use the brand for something which is generic, right?
Yeah.
That's not a problem. But this is something highly technical, and the fact that they didn't have any quality control, and the fact that they didn't have any contract, they've never shown what their contract was. I mean, all they needed to do is just show what their contract was, and that would dispel any doubt. But they've never shown what their contract amounted to. And so that lets us know that there was something very, very ugly, very, very untoward happening. And they have not come clean, and the Taiwan government has not come clean. And so here's the, inference that we can make is that Taiwan is going back to its ugly days when it was the subcontractor, U.S. and U.S. aligned global dirty tricks, such as the Iran-Contra scandal, which was run out of the World Anti-Communist League, which had its base in Taiwan, and the dirty wars in Latin America, which were the death squads were trained at the Pei-Tu Warfare Cadres Academy. So I think there's a real question that needs to be asked, and I 100% understand with the interviewees' outrage and just that moral injury of watching your neighbors and friends being blown up in front of you in this most despicable and deceitful way. And we also have to ask the bigger question, how is this happening? Who's responsible? What's the bigger picture? How are these alliances coming together and doing these horrific acts? That's something we need to ask.
That is a hard interview. It's hard as an American to have that interview because there's a certain amount of shame that goes along with having a conversation with someone where your country has created injury, direct, overt, overwhelming injury, and it's not conceptual. It's not like We're talking about a war that's taking place in Ukraine. Neither one of us are Ukrainians. And at the end of the day, Russia is winning that war. And you've worked for Sputnik or something like that, where you have some affiliation with the side that has been injured, that is responding to that injury and pushing back on world primacy. No, this is different. This is your tax dollars have gone into destroying her life, her house, her neighbors. Have gone into protecting the entity that is committing a genocide that borders her country and the country that is, the bloodthirsty animals that are committing that genocide, supporting those bloodthirsty animals, making the argument in court that they have the right to starve 2 million people. And let's be honest, was involved directly in bombing her country while the world effectively watched. Okay, that's a hard interview. And her moral outrage, and not even just moral outrage as a person that has endured it, is palpable. Like it comes off her, but it should come off her because it will come off of any human being that has gone through that injury. That is rough. That is rough.
It's
there are
rough.
the words for me to say to that, and it's weird for me to I didn't even want to cut her off because it's kind of like your moral outrage should be heard, and it feels bizarre to have the conversation as an American, knowing that I'm part of that, whether I want to or not, just because my tax dollars are going into making that nonsense, that atrocity happen. Yeah, it's a rough conversation.
It's a rough conversation, and it needed to be had. And what you are adding is that you're giving her a voice, and that is really, really important. That every little bit counts in this horrific struggle.
Yeah. Something interesting is happening around the world, and I want to get your take on it. So the Trump and Putin summit is taking place. And I've made the argument for the last week that the reason it's taking place, and by the way, one of my videos was even featured in an article in Russian. And somebody says, hey, you have an article that's being published. I was like, what? And apparently they went through my video and was going with the analysis that was in my video because I think my analysis is right. That all things being equal, there are several things that are acting on Donald Trump at once. One, Trump knows that the war is going miserably. They've just had a breakthrough that took place in Donbass, where Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, Konstantinivka, I believe is the way that's pronounced. I have a hard time pronouncing those locations. Zaporozhye, Kherson, all of these places are being pressured at once with the Ukrainian military effectively melting away. They're getting crushed, they're getting routed. Russia still has 2 militaries in reserve that it hasn't even used yet, that are effectively being trained, fully equipped, and everything else, was Ukraine doesn't have enough manpower to maintain its front lines, in which case its front lines are being broken. They've gone 10 kilometers in a day. So this is the context that's taking place on the battlefield. Trump knows it. He has to know it, which is the reason why it was, you have 50 days. Oh my God, no, you have 10 days. Oh, okay, we need to meet. We need to meet immediately. Because A, he just put tariffs on the world, and B, trying to put 100% secondary tariffs, which he knows cannot go into effect because it would reverberate and damage America, especially with negotiations taking place with China, in which he just blew off for the next 90 days. He went after India, but even with India, he only went after 20% of their products, not all of it. India, Brazil, China, Russia, all of these places told the US to F off. Trump is in a fix. And so he needs to negotiate immediately, which is the context of these negotiations and why these negotiations are taking place. From the standpoint of the Russian perspective, Putin did something that I found to be amazing. Whereas Trump went to huddle with the European leaders, he huddled with Zelensky and said, hey, this is what we're going to do. This is what we're going to talk about. You better accept my deal or else I might walk. Putin did something very similar, but to BRICS nations, talking to Brazil, talking to India, talking to North Korea, talking to all of these other countries in a way of forming a fulcrum that matches and maybe even exceeds the fulcrum of Europe, since Europe is basically vassals. Give me your take on that. I haven't seen that in recent history. This is new. Like, it's one thing if Russia is dealing with the US or all of these people alone. They are not. Obviously, they're not, because Putin is having conversations about Ukraine with other members of BRICS that, let's be honest, are being attacked by the United States as we speak. Give me your thoughts on that. This is a new norm.
Well, I think that, in geopolitics, it's always the idea that you either hang together or you hang separately. Your best chance of resisting is
Together.
working together. But, let's just look at some of these elements. The first thing is that, Witkoff is threatening other countries that are buying Russian oil with secondary sanctions. And this
Hmm.
is the economic approach, right? They want to put a tourniquet around Russia and see if they can choke it out. And these countries have said, go F your secondary sanctions. We're going to continue to do normal trade with Russia. And so that is not working. And that's striking because, the most, striking example, of course, is India, which is saying, go F your secondary sanctions. In fact, what Trump is doing is he's pushing India towards China, just as the Biden administration pushed Russia towards China, and so they're making every possible geopolitical mistake. They're just undercutting themselves. The other thing I think, which is historically interesting, and I'd say it's a historical redux, is that Trump and Putin are meeting, but neither the EU nor Ukraine are present at the table. And, to be trite, if you're not on the table, they say you're on the menu, right? Well, let's think back to the Korean War. When the end of the Korean War was being negotiated and the armistice was signed, uh, the countries at the table were China, North Korea, and the United States. South Korea was not present. South Korea has never signed any armistice with North Korea. And so, once again, you can see who the power players are, and you can see who the proxy is. You don't need the proxy, once you're coming down to brass tacks. In fact, the proxies, EU and Ukraine, don't matter. So I think that highlights that in probably the most, obvious way possible. And of course, I agree with you. This is Trump coming to a realization, which they could have come to a realization a year ago, that they're losing. This is not a war that they can win. They're losing this war. They want to cut their losses, see if they can pivot rapidly to China and have this division of labor and what they consider to be strategic sequencing. Again, it's not going to be so easy. As everybody has said, I think that the negotiations will happen, and Trump will want a rapid resolution of one form or another. But ultimately, this war is going to be decided on the battlefield, and clearly, Russia has the upper hand. Ukraine's defenses are crumbling. What also seems to be the case is they may be looking to launch another kind of deceitful false flag attack somewhere in order to derail the process. But we'll see what happens. I think a lot is at stake over the next few days. So all of this is to say, yes, this is both unusual and it also has historical precedence.
What do you think he's talking about with, meaning in Putin in this case, with either Xi Jinping, with Modi? Do you think it has to do with the secondary sanctions? That is like, I don't know if it would be military issues that he would be discussing with them. It may be economic, considering the Trump administration has made the choice to effectively go after them economically. Now, China, he's punted because he's apparently, as Carl Shaw would say, they got me by the balls. Like, we can't really do anything to China. But putting a huge amount of pressure on Brazil, on India. And I agree with you, this is going to backfire. But clearly, in the short term, this is not to the betterment of these countries. I mean, what do you think this conversation is with Brazil and India? Almost, I guess, shoring up their confidence, trying to make it, I guess, getting across like whatever negotiation, whatever plan is going to take place, you are also going to be included. Give me your thoughts on this.
Yeah, well, the thing to remember is BRICS is primarily an economic alliance. The
Right.
military alliance is the SCO. And so if it's a BRICS discussion, it's primarily focused on economic issues. And therefore, I think that a large part of this discussion is helping these countries resist secondary sanctions. And we can see that this is probably already happening, because since the US imposed sanctions, China's trade has gone through the roof. It has increased its trade by leaps and bounds with the rest of the world. Even as its trade with the United States diminishes, China's trade with the rest of the world increases. So it's essentially what we all predicted. As the US sanctions the world, simply other countries, what they do is they take those sanctions and they trade amongst themselves. And so what looks like a trade barrier or a wall against other countries is simply the United States enclosing itself. It's putting a brick wall around itself while other countries continue to trade. And I think that is probably what's going on. I think it's an acceleration of that. And of course, there are other elements of BRICS that are very, very important that are slowly being built out, primarily in the domain of financial resiliency against U.S. Financial sanctions. That's the other pillar of the U.S. strength. The U.S. has military strength. It has control, or certain, but starting to slip away, a certain control over the financial system. And then the third strength is the US's ability to do PR and propaganda. In fact, ultimately, the US's ultimate superpower is the possibility, is the capacity to mindfuck everybody. That is the US's ultimate power. And that's why journalism, real journalism, is so important.
Agreed. And the other superpower, of course, is the ability. Do you remember in I think it was the what is it called? What is it called? What is it called? Justice League. And everybody's talking about their powers, and they're like, "Hey, what do you do?" And Batman says, "I'm rich." This ability to produce money out of thin air. And Putin, God, man, Putin has hit this, and he hit this like years ago. And he pointed out something that I'm wondering if India is now coming to Jesus, recognizing, okay, yeah, this is an issue. We have to deal with this. It was the belief that India was the American friendly partner of BRICS. That India was the one who, yeah, I don't want to do the currency. I want to trade with everybody. America and I are still buddies, even though we're in BRICS. And just gets hammered. It's like, whoa, what the hell? I thought we were buddies. And coming to this reminder, we don't have buddies. We have vassals. We don't have equals. We have enemies and vassals. And I get that India wanted to play both sides, but I'm wondering now if India is realizing I can't play both sides.
Well,
they're not dealing with me in this terms. And one last point, I just want to show this. This is Lula, who has been hammering this point home very hard. Something that I think Russia agrees with, something that I think China may even agree with. But I'm wondering if India has finally come around to realizing that these guys are right.
Podemos discutir, sabe, nos BRICS, a necessidade de uma moeda de comércio entre nós dos
O senhor
BRICS.
não
Sem nenhum
recuou dessa
problema.
ideia?
Não recuo dessa ideia, porque é preciso testá-la.
He is effectively saying, look, I'm not backing down from this idea of us having a joint currency or to be able to pay for our stuff amongst ourselves. We need it. This is something we need to test. America has gone nuts. Do you think India has come around to that after all of this?
I would say that India probably needs a little bit more time. I think it's always been a little bit slow on the uptake. And I agree with you. It's always been a little bit of an amphibian. It's tried to play both sides of the fence. Is this the come to Jesus moment? I think we're getting there. I think the congregation is waiting for the arms to go up, the preacher, etc. It's like
right.
to the come to Jesus moment, because this is the core understanding that India needs to have. Sorry to be repetitive. It is dangerous to be an enemy of the United States. It is deadly to be an ally. And,
Yes.
When the bully gets frustrated, the first person that the bully takes it out is on the sidekick, because they are right close by. And so India is getting it. It's getting the frustration of the United States. And of course, there's plenty to beat India over with, because India traditionally has been an ally of Russia for the USSR. I mean, from its inception, it has always been closely allied with the USSR and continued into Russia. And of course, the most recent fact is that it was not going along with US sanctions. And so that's why we suddenly start to see all these criticisms of India and its human rights policy, which, I mean, those human rights issues were always the same under the Modi government, but they suddenly became an issue when India was no longer going along with the plan. But I think ultimately India needs to wake up. It needs to understand if it lashes itself to a sinking ship, it's going to drown. And I think they're coming to that understanding. And that's why, they've been aligning closely with Russia. That's why they've been recycling Russian oil and pretending that they suddenly had, an oil boom in their country. They've essentially been rerouting Russian oil, and they've been making out like bandits on it. And ultimately, they understand that, Trump is as much a threat to India as, the Trump administration, the US is as much a threat to India as it is to any of its enemies.
It's just fascinating. It's a new norm. I've never, if you think of when Iran was under pressure, Iran was by itself. If you think of when they were going after the Trump and Russia stuff, Russia was fundamentally by itself. It's almost like the world has broken into sides. And it's not militarily, it's economically. It's just, wow. It's like Putin has decided to work with his allies and work between his allies in coming up with any formulation of having to deal with not just sanctions, but secondary sanctions on those allies. Because let's be honest, what Donald Trump is doing is attacking BRICS. He may be putting it as, oh, these are secondary tariffs, and is using the language. But what he is doing is making a broadside. The attack on Iran was effectively an attack on BRICS. The attack on India is an attack on the weak link in the way that they see BRICS. The attack on South Africa. All of these are BRICS nations. Yes, he's tariffing the world, but 50%? That's not happening to the world. That's happening to BRICS nations. And when he makes speeches, he brings up BRICS. They are trying to undercut the dollar. We can't not allow them to undercut the dollar, so we need to go after these nations. And he's coming up with any pretext to do it. I don't know. It's just fascinating. That's all. It's almost like Putin is acknowledging, as you say, it's better to work with your friends than working by yourself.
Yeah.
There is another thing that came up. I have found myself fascinated by China hating channels. And the stuff that they say was like Xi Jinping is on his deathbed. They used to say that about Putin, by the way. Putin has cancer. Xi Jinping is about to be overthrown. The new thing that is out has to do with, and I guess there are two. One, and you have to explain this to me because I don't know I have no idea what this means. The soy sauce rebellion that this woman is saying something is taking place in Sichuan, and that China doesn't allow Sichuan, the word, to be said. So they changed it to soy sauce, and that this may bring on the revolution to overthrow the Chinese government. And I think I put an LMAO behind it when I sent it to you because it sounds so outrageous. We have protests in the United States. We had a 1 million man march that didn't overthrow the United States government of 300 million people. China is a government of 1.4 billion human beings. Please explain this. What is going on with this? And will this overthrow the Chinese government? Is this going to bring about the revolution?
I don't think so. It's not going to bring about the Chinese overthrow of the government. It's absolute nonsense. It just doesn't make any sense. But it is part of a long and protracted psyop that has been ongoing for decades. I mean, every year somebody or someone predicts the fall of China on some absurd and ridiculous notion. And so, in Sichuan, they're fiery people. They eat a lot of spices. They don't want to be, they're upset and they don't want to be, mislabeled. And so they're going to overthrow the government. Hillary Clinton, these are all collapsist doctrines. China, the underlying idea is that China is socialist, and socialist countries cannot sustain themselves because there are internal contradictions that are too deep, that go against human nature and go against the laws, quote unquote, of economics. Therefore, they're doomed to collapse. And therefore, all we have to do is sit back and take out the popcorn and watch, and we will see the collapse of China. This is a line of thinking that has gone back for decades, since the PRC was started. And more recently, this was the Hillary Clinton camp. The Hillary Clinton believed that China was a Potemkin state. It was going to collapse of its own internal contradictions. All they had to do was wait, and then wait until it collapsed, and then they would swoop in. U.S. equity firms would swoop in and buy everything up at fire sale prices, like they did in Russia. Well, that didn't happen. What happened instead was the U.S.-led global financial system collapsed, and the U.S. actually had to go to China hat in hand and ask for China for help. That's the point at which the U.S. decided that it needed to go to war against China, because China was not going to collapse by itself. That's when we saw the pivot to Asia. That's when we saw the battle doctrine against China, air-sea battle, being drafted. And so this has a long history. It's part of the PSYOP that says that it's a twofer. You see, on the one hand, the U.S. has to raise ire and manufacture consent so that the public will support going to war against China. And we're almost there. What is it? 79%, 78% say China is an enemy and a threat. On the other hand...
Wait, you mean of U.S. citizens think?
Yes, something like that. Yeah, they have an unfavorable opinion of China. And I think of that, a portion believe that China is a literal threat. That's a majority have a view that China is a literal threat. So the manufacture of consent, which has been happening for years now, thanks to mainstream media, the New York Times. The New York Times is essentially one long hate crime against China, but this has been continually building. And so you can see the consent has been nicely manufactured. And on the other hand, people understand that China is not a trifle. You cannot F with China, because China is a superpower unto itself. So to complement that, battle cry, you also have sectors of the propaganda apparatus saying that, look, China is weak. It's going to collapse. It's on its last legs. And so this is the recent, article by CSIS that says that, in a Taiwan war, the U.S. can win. These are the ways that the U.S. can win. And then this is also a much more plebeian type of, appeal, is that China is crumbling. China is just about to fall. All we need to do is give it a swift push down the stairs, a swift kick in the pants, and everything will be good, and we'll liberate, 1.4 million Chinese, except they're only 3 million because, the other, 1.1 billion don't really exist, right?
Right.
Nonsense. It's nonsense psyops, but it's being run out of, place. I think they're probably Falun Gong affiliated. They know that this is absolute nonsense, absolute and complete, total nonsense. But it's based on a deep contempt for the American public, because they think that the American public will buy and believe anything and everything. Because, that's the tragedy of it, right? Is that we're so indoctrinated that people no longer have the capacity to exercise critical thinking. And that's why I say, the US's, ultimate superpower is to mindfuck its population.
Yeah, but it's like, if you're born into it, right? Like if you are, if I raised you as a Nazi youth, you'd probably be a Nazi youth. you wouldn't know any better. Your value set, your value system, how you view the world, like you're programmed, like most people are. And it usually takes something for them to hit their head on where they're like, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. Like Jen was telling me how much she was raised. She was raised as a Zionist. And she was like, dude, it's intense. Like how you're framed, like what Muslims are, what Arabs are. They're out to get you. They're out to kill you. They're monsters. They're this. And you raise your entire life that way. And at some point, you have to almost like shake yourself out of the ideology. And that's not always the easiest thing in the world, especially in America, where the propaganda goes even to the propagandist itself. So it's where we're impartial media. And so we are not biased at all. We're perfectly independent. And yet we unfailingly end up backing whatever nonsense narrative comes out about the state or with the state, and being aggressive and violent, well, let's say aggressively propagandist towards countries who we define as enemies, whether they did anything to us or not. So Putin is like Adolf Hitler. He's the new Joseph Stalin. Iran is a terrorist state, as Donald Trump shakes hands with a literal terrorist, Jelani. And they would sell that. They would sell it. And the American public, if they're not following any other news from around the world, they would be like, oh, Putin is a bad guy. Xi Jinping is a bad guy. China's stealing our property and blah, 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 blah. Yeah, it's weird. Like when you work at a different radio station, it's a fog that you come out of and you're like, wow, this fog is thick. Yeah. You know what? And this is something Brian Berletic talks about, controlling your media space. Like how BRICS will have to invariably somehow control how it gets its media, which is weird to me because invariably, how do you do that? The only way you do that is by limiting other media that's coming into your sphere, which means at some level you have to limit your media. I don't know how you pull that off, but he's right. You have to.
Brian is absolutely correct. And as I said, not to be repetitive, the U.S.'s greatest skill is to deceive. That is its genesis. That it is its capacity. It's the capacity to mystify and confuse and indoctrinate and mislead people. There's a long history behind this. It's not for nothing that the great American play is, The Death of a Salesman. It's about a salesman. This is what the United States does well. It does sales better than anything else. And this has a long history. And the U.S. it's a country of hucksters, scammers, liars, and deceivers, right? I mean, it goes back to the revival tent. It goes back to the 19th century patent medicines, where they would sell, drugs inside of colored water and then tell them that this was going to solve all their problems. I mean, this is what Coca-Cola was. It was originally a kind of patent medicine. And now people have been indoctrinated to believe that fizzy brown sugar water is going to resolve all your problems and make your life great again, right? I mean, this is the American system. It's for decades, people were told that carcinogenic, cancer sticks were a sign of masculine virility, right? I mean, they do exactly the opposite. If you smoke, you're going to have problems, with your, virility. But they were indoctrinated into believing that, this was a sign of your liberation or your virility. So, this indoctrination is so deep and so profound. And it really is what the U.S. is so skilled at: marketing, PR, indoctrination, propaganda. And so, people here are indoctrinated to believe, even as their cities are crumbling around them, that they believe that they're living in the best of all worlds, that they have the highest standards of living. They believe that their minds are free, and they believe that, that other countries have propaganda, but that the U.S. doesn't do propaganda. We have
not anymore. They don't, Carl. KJ. Not anymore. Like, and in fact, I would argue, and give me your take on this, that the reason why Trump exists is because of, let's say, the dichotomy or the distance between what we saw ourselves as. Because at one point, yeah, the shining city on the hill, Ronald Reagan, with greatest, we're sending stuff into space, we're going to the moon, we're doing all of this stuff, and it's like, wow, we're a fantastic country. We're great. We're the greatest country on earth. I don't think Americans see that today. And because they don't see that today, they see we're dying 5 years younger than Europe. You can look over at China, especially because of social media. You can see other countries and you can see, hey, look at the stuff that they're building. Look at the high-speed rail. Look at this, look at that. And you get Jon Stewart arguing that subways and our shitty subways is the price of freedom. Okay, that's grotesque, right? Like the idea that the depravity or, being in substandard areas with high crime is the price of freedom is nonsense. It's a ridiculous argument. But I'm saying that is his soothing, self-soothing mechanism to try to say, well, hey, those subways are fantastic, but they're not. They're somehow radically different than us in regards to our society. It's nonsense. It's the way he's framing it to make himself feel better about the fact that things have degraded. It's an acknowledgement of degradation, not celebration of freedom. Those are different things. I'm saying that is where America is today, where they know it, they can feel it. And so who they get, a carnival barker who's a salesman who will tell you every time you're listening to him, America is great. We're doing great. Look at us take advantage of other countries. Look at us bring Ursula von der Leyen here, almost like a Roman bringing their fallen adversary in a cage where you can throw bananas and everything else so you can show the glory of Rome. And doing that from one leader after the next, after the next, after the next. There's a reason he does that. It's not, it's ego, yes, but it's also to show, look how great we are, that we can take advantage of these other countries. I think the reason, or part of the reason or rationale that Trump exists in regards to being a political figure is because of that degradation and that Americans don't see it in real terms. Give me your take on that. That's
No,
a lot of
I agree with you. I agree with you. I mean, people voted for Trump because they thought they were getting something different. But remember, this is a constant pattern in US politics. In the US duopoly, you get a set of policies, the people don't want it, and the opposition party says, we are going to give you something different. And so then they vote in the opposition party and they get the same policies because essentially it's a capitalist imperialist state with a very clear agenda for hegemony. And so you see a constant continuity of gender. They will tinker with different things, but ultimately the system doesn't change. What did Barack Obama do? He brought on the Republican medical, insurance agenda, right? People voted for Nixon because Nixon was supposed to end the war in Vietnam. He didn't. He expanded it to, the other Southeast Asian countries. They voted for Obama because he was going to end the war. He didn't. He expanded the wars. They voted for Trump because he was going to end these wars. He's not. And so this is a constant, little, trick that people fall for. And it's like, Charlie Brown in the football, right? I mean, Lucy yanks it away and he still tries to kick it. Every time it's the same thing that happens over and over again. And so there's a deep denial, a deep delusion. And yes, there's a desire to self-soothe. There's some real self-soothing that goes on. But the level and the degree of indoctrination is very, very deep, Jamal.
Yeah.
And so, for example, even when people, I hear people, for example, they criticize, for example, China. And then when you ask them, what do you base it on? Well, they say, well, this is what the mainstream media told me. Right. And you say, well, you disbelieve everything else about the mainstream media, but you believe that? It doesn't make any sense. But it just goes to show you how deep this indoctrination goes. Let me ask you a quick question, Jamal. Yeah. Getting personal here. Did you or do you eat breakfast?
No.
Oh, you don't. Okay. You are 1 in a million, and I don't eat breakfast either. But what do most people believe about breakfast?
Bacon. Best meal or the necessary meal of the day.
Yeah, necessary meal
Yeah.
of the day, the most important meal of the day, right? Do you know where that comes from?
I think you told me it was an advertising blitz because they were trying to get people to eat bacon or something to that effect, if I remember correctly.
It's a marketing slogan
Yeah.
invented by a PR firm for a meat processing company. And why did they go after breakfast? Why didn't they say, lunch or dinner is the most important meal of the day? They went after breakfast because that was the place where they had the greatest room to expand, right? Because people like you don't eat breakfast, or some people eat light breakfast. And so that's where the market possibility is. You can expand there. Whereas, in at lunchtime and dinner time, you're fighting an already full market. And so that's where that slogan came up. But most people will recite this chapter and verse. It isn't to say that, people shouldn't eat breakfast one way or another. I'm agnostic about that. I don't. But we know that many cultures and many people have very different customs around eating breakfast. But the notion that you need to eat a big meal at the start of the day and that it is the most important meal of the day, and preferably bacon, is a US marketing campaign. But it's just kind of embedded in us, right?
Yeah.
Most people believe this. And so this is the power of marketing. Same thing with diamonds, right? You get married, you have a partner, you give them a ring, preferably diamonds. Where does that come from?
Diamonds are a girl best friend, right?
Yes, but even before
Like I
that,
even know the slogan. That's so bad.
there you go.
Yeah.
It's from a diamond company. It's
De
from
Beers. Yeah.
De Beers, right? So we are so inundated. We're so kind of indoctrinated into these beliefs. And these things we can kind of pick up and notice because they're products that we can use or not use. But what people don't understand is that we're also indoctrinated politically into believing things about the US, things about other countries, things about the superiority of the US system. And it really is fiendishly clever. As I've said, it's like Baudelaire said, the greatest trick of the devil was to convince the world that he did not exist. Okay, the greatest propaganda coup of the West is to convince its people that it does not do propaganda and that people are free thinking, critical thinking, free thinking, independent thinkers. It is not true. All of us are indoctrinated, and it really takes real effort to kind of separate that and to bracket all the stuff that you've been fed, and to start to really think and see critically. But it's so important because you have to derive, as Mao said, truth from facts. Without a clear understanding of reality, you don't have a chance. Your compass is off. You cannot orient yourself. This is why the kind of independent media and the critical thinking are so critical for us to be able to orient ourselves properly. This is why people get up and read the news, because they want to orient themselves. Some people are news junkies. There's a kind of primordial need that we have to understand the world around us to orient ourselves around what is happening. And when that is constantly filled with garbage, we are completely disoriented. It's, as Marx said, it's like we're kept inside a camera obscura. A camera obscura, is a dark room. It's it's a dark room, and then there's a tiny pinhole, and through that pinhole, light comes through, and it projects an image of the world on the back of the camera obscura. And the problem is, the image is completely upside down. That's what we get. That's the camera obscura of modern propaganda.
ASACs, where's the floor? Like, where's the ground? Like when you're looking out at the world and you're trying to figure out, okay, what's true? And, oftentimes when we're dealing with stuff, we're so far away from it. Like, and look, as somebody who used to be a software engineer, I can make that screen do whatever I want it to because I control that screen. Meaning, a story comes up. They say, here's the story. Here's what's taking place. Okay, is it true? Who's involved? Does the media have a point of view? Does the media have an angle? That's not always easy for Americans or anybody in a society to filter. And let's also be honest, right? All societies have propaganda because they have to. Like you have a country of 320 million people. How do you get 320 million people to fall in line with a similar ideology, a similar value set, a similar thing? Okay, well, you have this propaganda of the flag, the Constitution. It's like the Bible. It's the thing that's right. It's the thing you should orient around. It's the thing.
I think the question, Jamal, is how do you get 320 million people to go against their own interests? That's where the work of mystification and propaganda has to come in.
Agreed. But I mean, is all propaganda bad?
Well, I would say indoctrination, mystification, confusing people, getting them to work against their own interests is really bad.
Agreed. That by definition, I agree.
Mm-hmm.
But don't all societies need propaganda, especially democratic societies?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is, it's not profound. This is what Chomsky said. He
Right.
said that, quote unquote, in liberal democracies, the need for propaganda is even more extreme because you have to manufacture consent. So yes, certainly. So this is why the US is so good at propaganda, because it has the absolute need for it, but it also has the long historical precedent and tradition of it.
I think the issue is the working against one's interests. Like, say, for example, we were living in a Star Trek society, and you have the Federation. We believe in love and light. We believe in, flying through the cosmos. We want to be the good guys, the best human beings that we can be. All of that is propaganda. All of it is. Like, none of that is necessary. You can have a society that's still focused on well-being, health, and everything else without this propaganda of we're going to go through the cosmos. We're going to put our lives on the line because it's the right thing to do. It's still propaganda. It's just in a direction that is for the betterment of humanity, as opposed to the way we use it to the detriment of humanity. I hope that makes sense. Like it feels like, I don't know how you get out that box. You're either stuck with an honest society where you can try to be transparent. You can try to be this shining city on a hill. You can work to the betterment of humanity and everything else, while instilling a certain view of the world that is to the betterment of that society. But isn't it all, on some level, indoctrination? Any way you look at it, you have to program a person with something for a person to move in a particular direction, especially if you're trying to build something large. Or correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe I'm thinking about this wrong.
I think that's a programming analogy, notion that, you have a blank slate and you program what you want into it. And, I think that's one way of seeing things. Certainly in political, philosophy, there's a long history of that thinking, going all the way back to the first fascist, who was Plato. He was the first person.
Thanks, AJ. Your thought is of the first fascist. Okay.
And so I think that is a legitimate, political philosophy. Let's put it another way. It's not that people don't require persuasion. It's not that people don't require some kind of consensus building through dialogue. It's not that people don't need to be educated, right? Yeah. Because people do need to be educated. And some part of our values is intrinsic to who we are as social beings, such as taking care of each other. I don't believe that you need to train people to do that. I believe that people do that automatically. Most parents will take care of their children, and they will, fight tooth and nail to defend them, as our previous speaker, emphasized, in the most, passionate way possible. So I think there's certain things that, you don't have to train people to do. And then there are other things that are more higher level, more superstructural, cultural artifacts that depend on how you want to direct the society, where you want it to go, and most particularly the means by which you arrive at those goals, which I think generally involve having a good life for the majority of people. unless you have a system which is just purely focused on the interests of the elite. And we do have such societies. In fact, we inhabit one at the current moment. And so I think certainly if you have a society which is built against the interests of the vast majority of population, then the demands for propaganda and indoctrination become much, much more extreme. And so that's why we are subject to this constant barrage of BS. That's why people eat breakfast or think that eating bacon for breakfast is the best thing they can do for them and their family, right? And on the other hand, I think that you do need to educate people. You do need to bring some kind of consensus about the direction and the means by which society should develop itself. I think that is necessary and important, and I distinguish that from the kind of indoctrination that I see in capitalist imperialist societies.
Agreed.
And part of it has to do with this ultimate contradiction is that the ruling elite knows that they're doing bad things.
Yes.
And that's where the deceit is necessary. And that's where the self-deceit is necessary. Let me give you a just very quick example. Jane Mayer is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist at The New Yorker. She got really famous because she wrote this series of articles called The Dark Side. And essentially, it was a way of unpacking the torture that happened at U.S. black sites like Guantanamo and Bagram, etc. And her, deep investigative, research revealed that this program of torture had been created by two psychologists that had been contracted by the army to build up this robust or enhanced form of interrogation, and that what they did was that they reverse engineered torture that the Chinese had subjected their American airmen to, right? Do you remember this?
I remember this. I remember Jane Mayer, and I remember the dark side thing. I didn't realize I don't remember the Chinese part of it, but I'm not shocked. It's like we have to absolve America from doing this.
So we have to blame the Chinese for American torture, but the piece that she completely, wiped clean was that the U.S. has a long history and tradition of torture. It didn't need to outsource anything. It didn't need to, look back and reverse engineer anything and borrow from Chinese, etc. U.S. has a long history of torture. I mean, think about the Phoenix program in Vietnam. Think about the Kubark manual. This is the CIA's torture manual. One of the things that the Kubark manual says is that take a person's strength and use that against them. That is ultimately what destroys them and depersonalizes them so that they can be putty in your hands. Extraordinary, vicious, violent, devious forms of manipulation and mind control and, psychological torture. All of this is in the U.S. Institutional memory. Think of Dan Mitrone, who was, funded by the USAID. He trained people to torture in Latin America. There's such a long history, tradition, curriculum, institutionalized, written down on torture. And somehow Jane Mayer ignores and erases that entire history. And then she says, it just kind of happened because the U.S. Army was trying to enhance interrogation, and they got these professional psychologists, and these professional psychologists didn't really know what they're doing, so they took the SEER program and reverse engineered, and the SEER program was originally designed to prevent flyers from cracking under Chinese torture, right? What a brilliant work of fiction. Yeah. And in so doing, she rewrote and she kind of completely whitewashed the history of American torture. And in response, she got the Pulitzer Prize and all kinds of accolades. I'm sure she's teaching journalism somewhere, but this is how the system works. It cleanses itself constantly, absolves itself of its ugliness of its sins, and then rewrites history. And then pretty soon, this is the standard thing that people tell themselves.
Agreed. That's media in America. I mean, that's in a nutshell. It's like it ignores our excesses while blowing up, exaggerating our opponents and our enemies. And so if you're in the country, you think to yourself, well, we wouldn't do something like that. That's not what we do. That's not us. I mean, we may make mistakes, but we're ultimately the good guys in this world of bad guys like Russia and China and India, and weirdly enough, anybody else that doesn't necessarily follow in as our vassals. It's a very weird system, but
it's a very deliberate system, Jamal.
yeah.
It's no accident. Let me just give you one more example now that I'm kind of, on my rant. But there's a guy called Orville Schell, and he was the dean of the school, the J School, the journalism school at UC Berkeley. Mm-hmm. Well, Orville Schell, if you look at his resume, from 1964 to 1966, he was in Indonesia. Okay, what happened in Indonesia from 1964 to 1966?
That was the war, right? What was the?
No, it was a genocide of communists, right? Okay. Genocide of communists, including many, many Chinese. And essentially, this was the bulwark against global liberation movements. Remember, Indonesia had, I think, the second largest communist party in the world. And it was also the center of the non-aligned movement, the Bandung movement, was in Indonesia. And as the imperial powers were weakened through the kind of intra-imperial conflict of World War II, the global South, the colonized countries were starting to liberate themselves. And, the key among these battles was, for example, in Malaya. The British didn't want to give up Malaysia. Another key battle was in Vietnam. The French didn't want to give up their colonies in Indochina, so they gave it to the U.S. And the U.S. fought essentially a colonial war against Vietnamese liberation. And then also in Indonesia. And Indonesia was one of the ugliest and dirtiest wars. Essentially, to prevent a kind of non-aligned movement from arising in Indonesia, the U.S. greenlighted and directed a plan of genocide against all the leftists in Indonesia. I mean, the rivers ran red with blood. We think somewhere between 500,000 to 1.5 million communists, members of the Communist Party, the PKI, were killed. And Orville Schell was the training associate for the Ford Foundation in Indonesia at the time. Now, the first thing to understand is the Ford Foundation was an annex of the CIA. It was actually the head of the Ford Foundation at the time was the person who had founded the OSS, which became the CIA.
Yeah, right.
And the Ford Foundation was doing the training for the Indonesian leaders that were conducting the genocide. So Orville Schell was in the thick of it. Now, in retrospect, he says, I was just a gopher. I didn't do anything. I knew nothing, etc. He tries to pretend that he was not involved. But we know from his own writings that he was trying to ferret out communists. He was like asking people and trying to meet with communists and trying to understand how they were organized and what they were doing. So he was actively, in any other terms, he was spying to find out who the communists were. Wow. And then the second thing is he says that he had no power, he was doing nothing, but he apparently, once again, according to his own writings, he had a huge office. He had his own house with servants and a chauffeur and everything. This was not the the role of an intern. He was in the thick of it.
Yeah.
And then he comes back to the United States. He putters around, pretends to do anti-war or social justice work, and then he creates this thing called Neiman Ranch, which is essentially a boutique slaughterhouse. It's a slaughterhouse that raises farm animals and then, kills them humanely, right? That is a very strange line of work for somebody to go into, an academic to go into, unless you are working out some kind of deep, deep contradiction inside your psyche. What kind of person starts a slaughterhouse, right?
Sociopath. I mean,
Some
that's what it sounds like. He was a sociopath.
Right. Okay. So then after he runs this boutique slaughterhouse, then he is recruited to UC Berkeley to start their journalism school. Now, how does running a slaughterhouse qualify you to run a journalism school, right? There's some weird stuff happening here. But anyway, he creates the UC Berkeley J School and generates, generations of, I would say, new propagandists. And Orville Schell's key line is anti-China propaganda. And he's the one who claims that, there's cultural genocide, etc. This is a guy who's directly implicated in literal genocide. And then he spends the rest of his career pontificating about an imagined cultural genocide. So this is how the system works. It's so deep, it's so insidious, it's so intricately designed and conducted. And so no wonder that we are so deeply, deeply indoctrinated and misled, because it goes right down to the foundations.
Wow. Yeah, that's intricate. That is intricate. I mean, this goes to the whole thing. Are they lying, or do they even know that they're lying? Meaning, do they know that they're lying, or are they just brainwashed? And it sounds like a bit of both.
They're both. They're lying and brainwashed, and they also know that they're lying. For example, Orville Schell, if you look at his resume, he says that he's PhD ABD. Okay, PhD, we know what that is. ABD means all but dissertation.
Now, by the way, he may know that he's lying. The people that he taught may not.
That's
I saw this interview once. Sanders was being interviewed by this guy, this journalist, I think it was Washington Post. And he said, hey, Sanders, when you were giving a speech in South America, they were holding signs up saying death to America. I mean, what do you have to say about that? You're there for it. And Sanders was like, are you out of your mind? What do you think was happening during that time? And the journalist was like, what are you talking about? He was like, we were paying kill squads in South America. Of course, they're going to feel some kind of way. Meaning, he is so in his ideology that he can't put himself in the position of somebody who's being murdered, killed, paid for by the US tax dollars, and is instead going after Sanders for giving a speech about either liberation or whatever the hell Sanders was talking about. This is liberals, right? So that's what I'm saying. The guy who taught them may be in on it, because he's the CIA, Operation Mockingbird and stuff like that, where they were effectively putting in their own journalists, paying all of these people off, academics and everything else. I don't know if all of these people are entirely aware that they are working with a particular ideology. I could be wrong, but some of them seem like true believers.
They do believe their own lies. This is definitely true. And also I hate the Orwellian, the way that Orwell confuses people, but on this he's correct. There is a kind of double think going on, is that they hold contradictory beliefs at the same time. So they know that they're lying, and they also believe that they are absolutely telling the truth. They absolutely do that. So, going back to Schell, he calls himself PhD ABD. That's nonsense, because ABD means all but dissertation. And a PhD,
means you're not a PhD. Yeah.
It means you're not a PhD. It means you didn't do the work. It means you didn't do your dissertation. And if you didn't do your dissertation, you're not a fucking PhD. He says, I did my coursework.
Right.
I did my coursework. I mean, that's nonsense. Most countries don't have coursework for graduate programs, because you're just supposed to get in there, do your research, start writing, and put forth your dissertation. And Orville Schell is, I went to PhD kindergarten. I did my, coursework, and therefore I'm a PhD ABD, right? I mean, so this is the kind of, self-delusion, narcissism that goes on. He wants to put himself forth as, a doctor of arts, but actually he, in his mind, knows that this is bullshit. And he also knows that and there's a part of him that wants to believe, that he is actually, a renowned scholar of bullshit.
Yeah.
And he also wants to present himself. So yes, this doublethink is very deep and profound among the ruling class. I believe Jane Mayer believes that she probably did good research, and that she has actually come to the bottom of the U.S. torture program. Of course she hasn't. She knows in her own mind, early in the morning, late at night, if she thinks about it, she knows that, she's sold, a bill of goods to the U.S. people. And yet they still believe it. And, the best example of this is MK Ultra, the
CIA program. Yeah.
They believed that the Chinese were brainwashing, and therefore they needed to come up with their own brainwashing program. And then they did all kinds of experiments with hallucinogens and, ridiculous things. And of course, this was a hallucination that they made up to justify the U.S. Airmen and POWs who were denouncing U.S. policy in Korea, which was genocidal, which did involve biological weapons. And in order to kind of, in order to refute and explain away what had happened, because these seem to be like decent, honest human beings, they said, well, they were brainwashed into denouncing the U.S. and telling lies. And they created this mythology, and even made a movie about it. This is the entire movie is about this. Then they decided that they had to do what the Chinese had been doing, and they created this program called MK Ultra, which is, ultimately,
LSD, spiking people's drinks, driving people nuts.
It was horrific stuff, yes. But it was all built on an illusion, but that didn't, keep them from doing it anyway.
KJ is like, I'm a vegetarian, but I eat chicken. It's like, you're not a effing vegetarian, right? KJ, thank you for this, man. Somebody asked if you were a historian. Well, yes, KJ goes into history all the time. Check him out on his channel, Breakthrough News Network. I don't even think we had the opportunity to introduce you. We went straight into it today. KJ, thank you for this, man. And by the way, the stuff that they were doing during the 60s was mind-blowing. The U.S. believed that the Soviets were into psychic research, which the Soviets were. And they were like, okay, well, we need to also test that. We need to get involved in that. And so they had a remote viewing program. That program went for like 20, 30 years. The Men Who Stare at Goats was one of the, I guess, kind of a allegory to that program. That program was astonishing, though. The Soviets, what they were doing with psychological research also was astonishing. Like, they were trying to come up with ways to kill people at a distance. Like, they were into some of everything in the 60s and 70s. So MK Ultra was just one of those programs that they were effectively working with. KJ, just the audience. KJ, no, he's a journalist, political analyst, writer, teacher, specializing in the geopolitics of the Asia-Pacific region, contributor to the book Capitalism on a Ventilator, once censored by Amazon. It is available at iacenter.org. You can also check out KJ on Breakthrough News Network on the China Report. When is the next video? Usually it comes out a day before.
It comes out every Tuesday, and my section of it will come out next Tuesday. It should be a good show. And, just before I close, once again, I want to emphasize to people that your mind is a terrain of battle. The Pentagon literally lists the mind, as a domain of war. And so then we have to resist this. And we also know the techniques that are used to hack the brain. They're literally techniques that you see most clearly in advertising, but frequency is the most common thing. You just constantly, something is repeated over and over and over again. As in advertising, you start to believe it. Okay. The other one is recency, which is tied to frequency. Another one is multiple sources. You're fed the same information, but it looks like it comes from multiple sources. Then you start to think that it's more credible. You're also given, sources that you are told are authoritative. Discount that, reason for yourself. And then another piece, very, very common, is these emotional hooks. This is to trigger, the mammalian empathy response. So it's written with, fear and pity, which actually goes back once again to the original first fascist, which is Plato. He talked about fear and pity. So watch out for these kind of emotional hooks that are written into, propaganda. So
Babies and
then,
incubators.
absolutely, and then ultimately, the key propaganda trope is the focus on the individual. That is to say, it's all about individuals. It's all about individuals, success or failure. And once you bring in that, kind of foundational ideology of individualism, then people are already confused. Because remember, as I said before, the term individualism doesn't exist in the English language until 1750. And that's when it's always prefaced by the term economic, that is economic individualism. Individualism or economic individualism is the ideology of capitalism.
Capitalists. Yeah.
Right.
Capitalists. Right.
And the
It's
reason
like
why they want people to believe in this individualism is the same reason why they essentially what it is. Individualism is divide and conquer, which has been internalized, because the ruling class needs to divide and conquer. It needs to individuate people, just like the predator needs to individuate the prey in order to take them down. The ruling class has a predatory relationship with the working class. In order to make that effective, they have to individualize, atomize, separate people so that they only think about themselves as individuals, so that they cannot resist in solidarity. And so that is the kind of the core ideology, goes back to Protestantism, et cetera, but that is the core control ideology that we are fed. And so these are the pieces that we have to start to unpack and challenge in order for us to have a chance at transforming things to a better world.
Yeah. If you have $1 billion, then you want to be, and everybody else to be like, the last thing you want is collective.
Yes.
What's your response to that? KJ, you are fantastic, man. Thank you for this. You be safe, okay? Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
All right. KJ is awesome.